everyone, welcome to From No to Nothing, Ontological Oxymorons. I'm your host, Joel Bouchard, a doctoral student in psychology, and with me today is Mr. Norman Gayford, a professor of English and philosophy. Since the chances you've heard the word jootsing are small, what comes to mind when you hear it? The first thing that popped into my head was an otter riding a surfboard with sunglasses while using a stolen vape pen. This whimsical, impulsive creativity is something many of us are familiar with, but rarely does it lead to any measurably productive outcomes. On the other hand, many of us are also familiar with studying, whether it's a subject in school, music theory, or our job functions. So, you may be saying, jootsing is just another word for thinking outside the box. Well, not exactly. It's also not the name of the pattern on the otter's purple and teal Hawaiian shirt.
It's an interesting word, this jootsing. I was concerned that we had to make sure that people understand that it's a word that's really acronymic. That's probably where you were going to start. But
yeah. So why don't you tell us, what is it? Is it jootsing or jootsing? Jootsing. Okay.
Joot.
Okay, I had the S and the T switch.
Yeah.
All right. So what is jootsing?
Jootsing, well, you mentioned thinking outside the box. Well, Daniel Dennet, who we've mentioned before, and who is invariably one comes back to, is a neurocognitive scientist, a philosopher, and someone who doesn't mind being edgy, and has written many fascinating, wonderful books on all kinds of topics, science and philosophy oriented. And his book that I was very much enjoying a few years ago was called Intuition Pumps and Other Tools for Thinking. And one of the tools he dubs jootsing, jumping out of
The
the system completely, right?
Yeah.
And what that means, though, is not the same kind of thing as what we mean by thinking outside the box. Because jumping outside of the system implies, it sounds like, oh, well, that's easy. We'll just get outside of a paradigm entirely, and there is no box. The box is behind us. But he insists on a few steps that are challenging.
Yeah. The article you sent me was very interesting because sort of delineating this term is really important to defining the concept itself, because he brings up several examples that people might jump to saying, oh, okay, well, this is what you mean, or this is what you mean. He says, no, that's not the same as jootsing.
Yeah.
And he's an interesting character. They mentioned him in my last psychology textbook, actually, the class that I had that I just finished, developmental psychology. They were talking about him a little bit. So he's had some influence in the scientific as well as in the philosophical realm. So jootsing, the term, originates with him. Do you think that there's examples of that going back historically?
I think so. I was pondering this morning that very thing because of an article that I came across reading the paper, New York Times, and it was an article about Thomas Midgley, who was a famous engineer, inventor, right? Not a chemist, more of an engineer, who lots of people probably don't know about now. But the article is about the centennial of leaded gasoline. And the article is about two of Midgley's most influential inventions, essentially. One being leaded gasoline and the other being chlorofluorocarbons. Probably single-handedly have done more to damage the environment than any other set of inventions. And that's a pretty big weight for somebody to bear post-historically. But I got to thinking about that and jootsing, and it seems to me that as he was trying to evaluate and talking to another friend who was significant in the industry, trying to evaluate what was making this knocking in engines, and that it was a problem with the explosions happening too early in the combustion engine, and they were taking the kind of images that they could at the time of what was going on. And essentially, he was far ahead of his time in how to try to do the problem solving, but he didn't have the tools that we have now, of course. And I mean, he apparently he did. He got polio in 1940 and was paralyzed from the waist down. And so he designed a contraption that he could use, pulleys and so on, to get out of his bed and put himself in his wheelchair so he didn't need any help. He also died by that contraption, and whether it was suicide or whether it was an accident, nobody's ever been quite sure. But he was so meticulous about his yard that people came from around the planet to check the way that he did his green yards in Ohio. Golf experts and all kinds of people. Well, he had set up a system so that when the weather was changing, a barometric reading and wind that might dry out the yard, he had on his dial phone, he set up a connection. So first, that would make an alarm in his bedroom that if the wind was changing, he would do this dial on his phone that would start the water sprinkler. So essentially, he had one of the first smart houses with what he had. And refrigeration with the chlorofluorocarbons, which is what created the hole in the ozone, which seemingly will heal in 40 years, even though the rest of the planet is in trouble. So I got to thinking about this, and I suppose that one could say that he jumped entirely out of the system in order to consider the combustion engine. But jumping entirely out of the system required what Dennet says, which is first you have to know your field, your discipline thoroughly. You cannot just have this rudimentary glancing look at a field that you might be interested in or practicing in. You have to know the field thoroughly, and you have to know all the rules within the field thoroughly. And then you take steps to find your way to a new thing, but you can't do that until you know the rules and why you are going to break them. And Midgley, of course, well, we don't know, but it didn't think ahead to what the ramifications would be. And so, and as with anything else, thinking way ahead, or thinking not just be outside the box, but rethinking entirely, breaking rules on purpose or choosing not to break rules on purpose because of a thorough knowledge in the field, that can still lead you into some bad terrain. It doesn't.
Yeah. It gets it highlights the important philosophical implications of this type of thing very starkly, right? Because, not only, Midgley's sort of a tragic character in a lot of regards, right? Because I think that in a lot of ways we don't hold historical people to that standard, especially an inventor, right? There's been lots of inventions that have maybe positively shaped society, but negatively shaped the environment. And then if you look at it philosophically, you go all the way back and you go, well, really any shaping of the environment is going to have some sort of impact, even, burning wood in a campfire, right, is having some kind of impact on what's going on. We still use combustion engines, even though we use unleaded gas, and they still contribute negatively to the environment and things. So with, like you were saying, if you jump out of the box completely and you're suddenly in this expansive ocean, right? And you make a change, it can be difficult to interpret whether the change that you made is positive or negative when you're that far afield, when you're that far on the cutting edge. A change can lead to something good or something bad or something that is both, right?
This is why science ethicists, business ethicists, they actually exist. There are people who do this, are more than seriously now saying that we have to have conversations about to what extent we want to think about what something we do, how something we do might affect generations down the line. And we can go back to the indigenous people's paradigm of 7 generations hence. We still haven't managed to do that apparently as a species overall. And so now we have ethicists saying, well, before you apply something, before you get that far, really there ought to be a whole lot of thought about whether or not it's going to affect those people, or maybe there shouldn't be that much thought because if otherwise we don't survive. But that discussion has to happen, and it often hasn't.
Yeah.
Happened.
Yeah, and so the scientific implications of it and the ecological implications of it are interesting, but there's other implications of it as well. And especially for the person doing the jootsing, right?
Yes,
I mean, if you look at throughout history, examples of people radically changing the paradigm of science or of whatever, they generally don't tend to be treated very well.
No, because they've upset the apple cart terribly.
Right.
Someday that phrase is going to go because people are going to say, what's an apple cart? Right? People may already do that because our metaphors are linked to the language of our particular time or our forebears until it goes away. But for lack of a better thing, Einstein upset the apple cart. So did Richard Feynman, an amazing teacher, amazing scientist. And I have to say on the side, I should have acknowledged Douglas Hofstadter, who friend of Dennet, is actually the one who coined the word jootsing, but Dennet obviously gives lots of attention to it. So, but in the case of Einstein, someone who knows his field so deeply, intricately, that he can then take the next step and say, all right, these are all the rules. Which rules absolutely cannot be broken? Which rules can be bent? Which must be in order to take us to the next one? And asking that set of questions then leads to the next step.
Yeah. Yeah. And Einstein was lucky enough to be able to see the fruits of his labor sort of validated within his lifetime and benefit from that. And not all historical figures really did make it that far. There's a lot of people who are historically persecuted, usually by religious organizations, that end up dying in solitude or sorts of things for contributions they tried to make to science. But yeah, you have some other examples, right? You have Copernicus with heliocentricity, right? This idea that everybody's observing the same sky for all of history, but just with the assumption that the Earth is at the center of the universe, right? Why wouldn't it be? Until somebody says, "Well, wait a minute, no, that's not what the stars are telling us." Or at a Junior Barnard, which is not the inventor, but the first person to use guitar distortion in an artistic way, right? Up until that point, the limitations of the technology had been such that guitarists were always trying to get the cleanest guitar sound that they could, but the louder they played in big concert halls and stuff, their amplifiers tended to break up and make this distorted sound. And they said, I don't like that. And then this guy finally said, you know what, I do. I think I can make this into a usable sound. And then inspired, decades of of musicians after that.
Yeah.
Or Frank Canova, who was the inventor of the first smartphone, right? Up until that point, all of the transistors and electrical components that had been used in computers had been so big that had been their only application. And then at some point he said, these things are small enough that you could put them in a handheld device. What would happen then, right?
Yeah.
And I mean, again, it took decades before that was ever realized by another individual how it could be used in a practical way.
And I think that's because of the nature of knowing the discipline. I think that's really worth the heavy emphasis here. Because when we say, think outside the box, it's usually, it's an attempt to be creative. And just because it has a kind of spontaneous kind of feel. When somebody says, think outside the box. That's essentially saying, break some of the rules. But Dennett, Hofstadter, and this philosophical position says, no, you don't just go breaking rules because you want to break rules. That shows no discipline at all. You got to know what all the rules are. You got to know the system intimately, and then you can decide which rules are, in your estimation, impossible to break, but which ones can be bent, which ones can be actually broken. But why are you doing that, and why are you choosing to do that and not break some other one, and so on and so forth? That takes time.
Yeah, which is why Dennett talks about in that article that you sent me what things aren't jootsing, right? And one of the examples he uses is of children, right? Say, children are jootsing, right? Because they're not in the system at all, and they'll spout off all kinds of creative stuff. Mm-hmm. Well, that really comes back to my otter riding the surfboard, using a vape pen, right? It's just this sort of thing. So that
Stitch comes to mind.
Yeah, and I was wondering if you were going to give me some grief for it, because the term that I used in the intro was is that type of creativity rarely leads to any measurable productive outcomes. No, and I thought you were going to say, it depends on how you define productive outcomes and what the purpose behind this sort of creativity is.
Well,
and I was ready to have that conversation, but we don't need to. But the point being that type of creativity, that children are a hallmark of it. I'm always getting quizzical looks from my wife because I'm just spouting off nonsense like that, right? Yeah. I hear this word jootsing and I see an otter on a surfboard smoking a vape pen. That's just the first thing that pops into my head.
That's creative. It's
creative. But at the same time, where does it get you, right? And a really good anecdotal example of this, I think I told you about it, is I was out shoveling the driveway this winter, and my 8-year-old nephew comes out and he's obsessed with ninjas, right? So he's asking me questions about ninjas, and I'm giving him the answers, and then he starts wanting to tell me ninja jokes, right? That he's making up on the spot, and they're just all nonsense. They're not funny. They don't make any sense. I'm doing my very best to pretend that they're funny, but that's just nonsense, right?
Yeah.
And then he asked me, well, do you know what ninjas eat? And I said, no. What do they eat? And he stopped for a second. And I could tell by the way he's looking back and forth that he's trying to think of what the punchline. He got
himself into a box.
Yeah, he had, these weren't pre-planned jokes. He was just spouting off, right? And that's the childish creativity. But he said, "What do ninjas eat?" And I said, "I don't know what." And he looks around and he's thinking. He goes, "Kung food." And I go, "You got it." That's I laughed. I said, "That's really funny." So that's the one example, right? He told me 100 jokes, none of them were funny, and then that one made sense. And, Dennett talks about how that's not jootsing, right? Because that's just getting lucky, right? Everybody gets lucky. A broken clock is right twice a day. That's not jootsing, right? So, and there's examples of that throughout history, right? People who have no prior knowledge of the system at all coming in and making a revolutionary change. But that's not something that can be reliably recreated. It's not an approach. It's just creativity that happens to be lucky.
It doesn't acknowledge all the previous. We've talked about scaffolding and verisimilitude and these concepts that are about acknowledging the steps and the failures and the steps and the failures in any particular field, and that's that come in, radically change something just because. Well, it can certainly lead to things, and it certainly has implications and ramifications, but it's not about valuing what might need to be maintained in a field. Foundational knowledge that still works, or this is why it takes time. And so that's, again, I think that's important. I think you have to have a lot of time in working at or with the knowledge in the particular specialty or space you've chosen to work in order to then think about what can happen. I mean, in your workplace, I know that happens. Some of the things you've told me, anecdotes without names, but of people solving problems that might not have been, or going back to a principle that somebody else was really trying to bend because the rule really had a reason for being a rule. I was thinking about the number of, I've forgotten exactly, but it's a widget or something. The number,
The number of cavities in a mold.
In a mold. Yeah. And that stays with me. That's an intuition pump. That's what Dennet talks about. An anecdote, a little tale, Aesop's fables, which we spend a lot of time with, right? You tell this little tale, and that reveals both a way that people generally think and sometimes a way to break that rule to go forward.
Yeah. And Dennet really, he highlights the difficulty of this in the example that he talks about where, saying that, like we were talking about the example with the kids, right? Or, abstract art, right? People saying, oh, well, my 5-year-old could do that, right? Well, no, there's something, a 5-year-old could create something that sort of resembles it, but it's not the same. And going back to Midgley and this idea of changes that could be good or bad, the illustration that they give is that, it's like going into a house and, looking at a wall and trying to determine if it's load bearing before you knock it down, right? Sometimes, sometimes you might make the right decision and, it opens up a space, and sometimes you might make the wrong decision and the house collapses on you, right? So it's very, it's difficult. Like, that's why I think a certain, knowledge of the field, knowledge of the house, of what you're doing is important, because, you have examples that are, like we said, Einstein, pretty clear cut, right? When he first came up with relativity, it was a little bit like the abstract art of physics at the beginning. People looked at it and they said, this is gibberish. This is like scientifically and mathematically nonsense. What is he doing? But then as they started to make observations and they started to do verifying claims, they go, oh no, this is actually a masterpiece, right?
Yep.
But in aesthetic arts, that's a much more difficult determination to make, right? Pablo Picasso, an excellent representational painter, then all of a sudden he starts painting this stuff that is non-representational, and people start going, oh, well, anybody could do this, right?
Yep.
And so then trying to determine, well, is the wall that Picasso knocked down load-bearing or not to the field of aesthetic art? It's a more difficult determination to make than it is in the realm of physics, where you can run observations and experiments to confirm a theory.
You just made me think of it. This is a family anecdote, but it always makes me remember my mother with such joy. My dad's a mechanic. My mom worked at all kinds of factories and what people might call drudge jobs, but jobs that needed to be done and cooked, and she just did so many things. But she often wanted changes in the house, and as with anybody, the mechanic's car is the last car to get fixed, and she would just go ahead. And I was thinking about her with this topic because one day he came home from work and he found my brother and I and my mom using sledgehammers on a wall. What's going on? She said, "You said we could take this wall down. I wanted a bigger dining room, and we're not getting these walls down. So I decided it was time to do the walls." Yeah, I'm paraphrasing, but that was it. And he's looking, and he said, "Well, did we talk about it being load bearing?" And I remember her saying, "Here's where the beams are that are load bearing. The walls can come down." And until we were talking, until you said that story, it didn't occur to me that jootsing, in a sense, applied to what my mother did, because his assumption was that she was just jumping out of the box to knock the walls down to make a bigger box.
Right.
She knew that it wasn't going to bring the house down, but that aesthetically, it was something that she wanted.
Yeah. So this raises an interesting question, right? Which is it necessary to be an expert in order to joots?
Well, I think it's now I can do this. It depends on what you mean by expert.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. So, and I think that we could do a whole episode on what expertise is, right? What level of knowledge is needed? When do you define when somebody is an expert, right? How do you know when you've reached the level of knowledge that you're going to joots like Albert Einstein and not like Thomas Midgley?
No, that's a marvelous question. All right, I'm going back to my anecdote for a moment to start there and work up. My parents we'd lived in this house for many years. They were the kind of people who paid very much attention to what was underneath the walls, so to speak, and where the pipes were and so on. So she had an expertise, an informal expertise of what the house, its structure, its form, its qualitative nature. And so I think that in making an aesthetic break, she wouldn't have called it that, but that's what it was based on an expertise of lived experience. It's not an academic expertise, but it's an expertise of lived experience. I think if you talk about an engineer who's worked for 40 years at something and can tell you which rules can be broken and which ones can't, but tries to break the rule, but then says, "Yeah, sort of told you so." I think that's an expertise. I think experiential expertise, if it is truly based on learning as one goes, because there are people who practice in a field for 40 years and you'd swear that they hadn't learned a thing because they just keep doing everything exactly the same way, no matter what. There are teachers who do that. There are, in any field you will find this. I don't think there's any jootsing available to them because I don't think they've kept up with their fields.
Yeah, and this is where expertise gets really interesting, right? Because everybody's heard that business term, right? Well, if you want to be an expert, you need 10,000 hours of practice, right? Okay, so if you have 9,999 hours, you're just a novice. But if you have 10,000 hours, you're suddenly an expert, right?
Yeah.
It totally neglects the qualitative experience of what we are defining as practice, right? What determines practice? I've talked about this before. As a guitar player, right? There's many types of guitar players. There's a lot of debate about who the greatest guitar player to ever live was, right? And it's really a bit of a nonsense question, or at least it's not, you're asking the question in the wrong way, right? Because I think that you could probably define who the most technically proficient guitar player is, right? You could find who the fastest guitar player is. You could find who the guitar player that has the knowledge of the largest number of scales is.
Yep.
You could find the guitar player who's made the most innovations in a technological format. It's much harder to determine who the most creative guitar player is or something like this. But the point being that how you define what makes somebody the greatest guitar player of all time is going to lead to several different candidates for that position.
Yes, it would.
It's really not any different when you're talking about the greatest to ever do it versus somebody who's an expert, right? So I'm not an expert guitarist, but even like thinking about being a guitarist in general, there are times where practice means sitting down with the guitar and developing a skill, whether that skill is speed or accurate fretting or, a new technique or something. But there's also times that I consider guitar practice where I don't touch the guitar, where I read about music theory or I study, tabs of another guitar player, or I just actively put the idea of the guitar out of my mind in order to break rote patterns that have developed so that when I reapproach the guitar, I'm doing something that's fresh and different from the things that I just do. And so you could practice for 10,000 hours and it could be just this stale, repetitive thing. And maybe you master that stale, repetitive thing, but that's all it is. But you could actively put the idea of guitar or whatever your subject of practice is out of your mind for months at a time and come back and have a much more important breakthrough than you would have had if you had been practicing 16 hours a day for those 2 months that you had been away.
Mm-hmm.
So expertise and how you become an expert and what you consider practice and how you consider approaching a field. This is a very complex, multifaceted phenomenon.
It is.
That goes far beyond this very simplistic business idea of saying, well, if you practice 10,000 hours, you're an expert, right?
That's the simplistic thinking. And Dennett himself says, if you can find a simple way to do something, that makes sense. But what in yoga it's called samskara. You can do the same thing over and over and over again. And if it's something that's not leading you to more development, it might be a rut.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what you were just describing. Richard Feynman says, among many other things, that you really, unless you can turn off the jargon of your own field, you want to know if you're really learning something and going forward and you've really gotten the concept down that you thoroughly understand, you put the jargon away, you explain that concept to somebody in elementary school, and you literally work your way through. You find a child to try to explain the concept to see if they can get it. And you're going to run into walls and it's not going to, and you have to go back and you rethink something else again. And then you put it together. And after that, can you put it into a story? So you have a narrative of how that concept developed and it's put in a way that a third grader can understand. Then you go back to your field and say, okay, now I'm using this jargon a whole lot more creatively and productively. But that's a lot of work.
Yeah. No, that's a pet peeve of mine in my program is like in any, when you start out in the first 2 weeks, you have a bunch of students and then you have discussion boards and you see what people write. And even at the doctoral level, there's people that write and you go, okay, so you're using a bunch of new terms that you read in the first 2 chapters of the book and you're applying them wrongly and it's not accurate, but it's got a bunch of jargony words in it. And those people, they tend not to last. They tend not to make it through the program for good reasons. But, that's something that I've been, people have said to me a few different times, you really have a good way of explaining something in a way that I can understand it. Like, you don't make me feel dumb, and I understand what you're trying to say. And like you said, that really is a good way of determining what you actually know, right? Anybody's able of learning vocabulary, but that doesn't determine whether you know anything about what you're talking about. You're
just demonstrating to me again why I've said to you, as I've said to some of my other former and incredible students, you're a teacher. At heart, you're a teacher because that's how you approach things. You don't try to dumb it. It's not dumbing down. I despise that phrase because it already implies a whole lot of negativity that doesn't need to exist. The books that, no matter how humorously they were intended, carpentry for dummies or something like that. It's a word we shouldn't be using. And it's not dumb to be able to talk to people who don't have the same jargon of your particular field. It's eminently wonderful if you encounter, as I have been fortunate to, someone who's does plumbing or electricity, and recently we had a problem in the house, and the experts didn't seem to be able to solve it, and it seemed to resolve itself, but they did not talk to me as if I knew nothing, but they talked to me as I invited them to, which is, I'm somebody who has an expertise in teaching in English, some in theater and philosophy, but I'm not an electrician. I can do a breaker box. I could change a fuse. I can change a light. I've even put together, put a fresh light in, but I'm not an electrician. And if you can talk to me and tell me what you think the problems may be or how you're trying to solve those problems without using the jargon to help me understand, then you're somebody who's really practicing well in your field.
Yeah. And this, it's, at work the other day, some people were having a conversation and they called me over. They go, "Hey, we were just talking about it. We think you're the smartest person in the planet." And I said, "That's ridiculous." I said, that's, I don't agree with that at all. They said, "Well, who's smarter than you?" And I said, "Every single one of you is smarter than me in some way." I said, "Kenny's been in, there you go with the names. This guy's been an engineer for 42 years. He knows all kinds of stuff about it. This guy's a sales engineer. I don't know the first thing about sales. I don't know anything about any of this stuff. Like, I know some about a few different things, but, everybody is smart in their own way." And they said, "Well, but as far as here goes, you're probably the one person that knows the most about anything here." I said, "Okay, well, that might be accurate. I've worked on every machine. I've done the quality functions. I've done the planning functions. I've done the inventory functions. I've done some of the invoicing and sale. I have done more of every individual job in the plant than anybody else," which is kind of an interesting thing to think about. But,
it is, yeah.
But yeah, this idea that intelligence or that expertise is some sort of static crystalline thing that overarches every aspect of your cognition is very flawed.
It is.
But it leads us back to the initial question, which is, how much knowledge do you need to be able to jump out of the system, right? What do you need to know? Right?
You need to know the fundamental rules that seem to adhere to that particular topic or field or profession. Got to be conversant. It doesn't mean you know everything, because we know that nobody does, and you've just adequately very much rendered that as a marvelous anecdote. But it means you do your best to know how it all works.
Yeah, I think that the most discouraging response, because people do ask me to do this sort of thing a lot, where, they go, "Hey, what is this?" And so I try to explain it in very, in terms that people can understand. And then after I do that, they go, "Well, why didn't you just say it that way in the first place? Or why do we need all this jargon?" And I go, well, because although jargon sort of has a pejorative association with it, the fact is, and you and I have talked about this before, words exist for a reason, right? Like
yes.
If all of these advanced concepts could be explained with these smaller words and these smaller concepts, there'd be no reason for the bigger words and the bigger concepts to exist. What I've just told you is like taking a very compressed picture, right? It's like, sure, you can make out that there's a person and a tree and a house, but there's no details, right?
Right.
The jargon, the advanced concepts, all these other things are what now you can see the individual leaves on the trees. Now you can see, that the person has glasses. You can see inside the windows of the house and what the fixtures are and stuff. You have all of this detail that allows you to further your exploration of it. So, I think that there's something that goes both ways, right? You can't, in order for this idea of jootsing, right? The box is very important. You don't want to be inside the box, but this idea that the box is irrelevant, or that anybody can jump completely outside of it and know what's happening is also kind of flawed.
Yes, you don't just jump to jump. Now, I think of action adventure movies and science fiction films and all. Sometimes people have to jump off a planet or down to a planet or off a cliff, but it's not because they were contemplating it. It's out about all the rules of gravitation, and it's an act of desperation. Agencies or companies or groups that tell somebody to think outside the box because we need something new right now. That's not jootsing. That's desperation.
Yeah.
We got to go to the next, so some of the, you probably read in one of the blogs. Anyway, so an example of jootsing would be dry shampoo.
Yeah.
Right. But what leads to that is you can't have soap that isn't activated by water. Well, turns out you can. How do you have a taxi, become a taxi driver without being a taxi driver? Uber and so on and so on. You have to know, if mocktails, you have to know how alcohol works and functions and what kind of combinations in order to figure out a taste that's something like it, but isn't the thing. Now, those are mundane, pedestrian examples from the business corporate product world, but it's still not about just jumping for the sake of jumping.
Yeah. It reminds me of the scene from the movie The Other Guys, where you have Samuel L. Jackson and I can't remember who the other one was. But anyways, the movie opens up with these two super cops, right? That are just, driving muscle cars through buses and, getting in shootouts and doing all this cool stuff, right? And then they get on top of this building. They're chasing this bad guy. They're on top of the building. And the bad guy, zip lines off and then cuts the zip line. It's The Rock and Samuel L. Jackson. They look at each other. They go, "You think what I'm thinking?" He goes, "Aim for the bushes." It's like, "Yeah." And they jump off the building. And they just splat onto the sidewalk dead. And then Will Ferrell and Mark Wahlberg, the other guys, these office guys, have to become real cops and solve cases, right? And so that's just sort of a poignant example, right? We get bombarded by these hyper-masculine sort of representations of impulsivity and how it leads to these all outcomes, right? And you and I talked about off the air last week about there's a negative article in the New York Times about podcasters and how it's this male dominated industry where you basically have little mini Elon Musks running around just spouting off Joe Rogan-esque sorts of nonsense and how people are sort of poisoned against it a little bit, and that's sort of the equivalent of being Samuel L. Jackson in The Rock, right? This idea that, okay, well, we're just going to get on air and we're going to say whatever we want, and it's gonna work out. It's gonna make sense, right? Well,
you go splat.
You go splat because
splat sometimes, but you don't.
Right, because real life is not a movie, and getting on a podcast and talking about stuff just because you have an audience doesn't make you right about anything. And we're transparent about that all the time. We're regularly wrong. I started out this episode by calling it jootsing, right? So, I mean, it happens. We're humans.
We're humans. We switch a letter.
But it's a pretty poignant example of this thing that we're talking about. Like you were saying, just jumping outside the box just to jump. It really goes back to the childish impulsivity or this sort of hyper masculine arrogance And but you know, at the same time, and a lot of that hyper masculine arrogance part of it are these guys that spout the 10,000 hours of practice.
Yeah.
But as we talked about, practice, if you're thinking about it as just doing one thing over and over again, is not going to help you make those groundbreaking innovations that these guys are looking for, right?
Because you're not necessarily in practice. If it's rote practicing, there's a use for that to keep yourself in your fingers in shape and so on. But if you're not thinking about, but what if, and how come, and what are the rules for this, the thirds and fifths and so on, which means thinking about music theory and yeah, it's. I agree about the hyper masculinity that it seems to be involved with this. Dennett says in his book, he says the middle ground, roughly halfway between poetry and mathematics, is where philosophers can make their best contributions. There's an art and there's a science to the discussion, and these contributions can yielding genuine clarifications of deeply puzzling problems. A clarification of a problem doesn't mean a solution to a problem.
Yeah.
It says, oh, let's shine up this problem up and clean off the rust and see what the problem actually is.
So I'm going to go the other direction now. So we just talked about, I asked the question, is it necessary to be an expert, or what level of knowledge is needed to become an expert? And we talked about how, yeah, your 10,000 hours of practice or your rote practice is not going to get you there. So going the other direction, I'll ask, is jootsing more than just the marriage of philosophy and creativity? So in other words, without any practice, right? Let's say I'm a philosopher. I'm somebody who studies this thing, because I don't think you can say scientist. I don't think you can say artist, because jootsing at its core is jumping outside of the box. And outside of the box, there is only philosophy, right? Inside the box is where science and philosophy are. Or science and art are. Outside of the box is all there is the ocean of philosophy, right? So is jootsing more than just a marriage of philosophy? In other words, trying to rationally examine the principles of the construct of a pattern and then being creative about how you approach it?
It's a fine question, because you use the metaphor of marriage. If a marriage stimulates those who are married to become more than they would have been, to deepen themselves, to go to places that they hadn't gone, whether physically, mentally, or geographically, whatever. That, yes, then it is more than a marriage of things, because it implies a set of choices to take risks that are considered, that weren't necessarily considered by anyone else inside the box. The world goes on the way it goes on in the box. Somebody studies all those rules and says, no, this one thing could be different. If this rule were broken, it would lead to better things. I'm jumping outside by breaking that rule. And I think that Dennet doesn't discuss and didn't need to, but for me to pursue the metaphor is, you're not just in the ocean anymore. You have fashioned a sphere instead of a box, or a tetrahedron, and you've brought the box inside the sphere or the tetrahedron. So you're not just floating around in the ocean when you've juiced it. You have, in much the Campbellian way, you have taken what you've found, brought it back to your ordinary place, and therefore transformed some within that ordinary place, not all. You can't ever go back and live there entirely, because you're not the same person. Your process isn't going to go back. Some people are still going to do the process the same old way, but if it's significant change, some people are going to be affected by it, and so they're going to be living in a different shape.
Yeah. Yeah. So jootsing is really sort of an emergent property of philosophy and creativity and practical experience integrating synergistically.
Yes. Yes.
All right. Yeah, I like that. And I think that that's sort of reflected by modern approaches to undertaking things. When you look at, sort of cutting edge things like AI development or that sort of stuff, usually the staff that they have on board these sorts of things, you have scientists, you have people who are grounded in the practical and theoretical aspects of it. But you also see that they do have philosophers, and lots of times they have people devoted to aesthetic design. You have these sort of multidisciplinary teams that approach these things because you need all aspects of it in order to properly develop the whatever it is that you're working on. Mm-hmm. So is jootsing a necessary aspect of being a polymath, do you think?
That's a really interesting question. Is it necessary to can you be a polymath and not joost?
Yeah.
What you say? Well, I think so. I think you can be a polymath and not joost if you don't do anything. Okay, be careful here.
Yeah.
On the exterior, in the realm of changing things. But I'm being really careful. Because if you're a polymath and you're an artist and you're an engineer and just look at you, all the things that you do, but you do them. You wonder about, but then you follow through and do it. I wonder if I can make music a little bit differently because I know the rules basically, and I'm going to change this. That's a kind of jootsing.
Yeah, and you see, that's where it's interesting because when I was writing the questions for the show, I went through the same thought progression that you just did, where the question popped into my head, and I was like, "Oh, that's an interesting one." Then I thought, "No, that's stupid. Of course you can be a polymath without jootsing."
But it's not stupid.
But then I thought, "Well, no, wait a minute." I again drawing on the psychological science that I'm aware of, and really. Can you learn anything without incorporating your prior knowledge and experience? And humans as metaphorical beings, right? Can you even conceptualize a new construct or a new field without putting it in terms of other systems and fields and constructs that you've approached?
I don't think you can.
Yeah, and there's Dave Grohl, right? The lead singer and guitar player for the Foo Fighters. He used to be the drummer for Nirvana. He talked about learning guitar, right? And he said, well, I taught myself guitar, and the way that I did it is I just thought of the guitar as a drum set. He said, well, these low strings are kind of like the kick drum. These high strings are like the cymbals. And so he taught himself how to play guitar, and it's not like other people play it. There's a rhythmic quality to it, and the approach is much different. But that's this idea of, all right, they're both within the realm of music, right? But you're going from one instrument to the other. And that's a very explicit example of carrying over knowledge from one to the other. But I think even implicitly, even without knowing it, subconsciously, I think that we take almost everything when we approach a subject to learn it without knowing it. I think that we take everything else that we've learned and it comes with us to how we approach it.
Yeah. I agree that. Certainly. Any new thing that I have studied becomes somehow affected or affects the previous context, which is why one does it. I mean, when I was stumbled into the theater program where I taught, I was invited in by a marvelously dynamic artist, and who then allowed me and insisted really that I learn some of the rules and the pillars of theatrical practice as that person had learned them. And then what do you do with that? Well, I spent years I said being the theater mascot, but I was practicing, I was directing, but I was learning, but I wasn't a professional the way my second born became in theater. I noodle around with piano, but I'm not a composer professional the way my son is. I don't have that knowledge of music theory, but the fact of practicing music on my level affects my day, affects my psychological being, affects how I interact with the world. Music is a constant part of my life. I'm not jootsing, but I'm aware of how that could happen.
Yeah. You know, in my experience, it seems to me almost like it's easier to joots if you're not an expert. I think that, and of course, this is all anecdotal, just from my own experience. But like, what I always tell people is I like to learn a new thing until I become slightly above average at it. And then I like to hang out. I like to be a 6 out of 10 on something, right? And then I move on to something new. Now, when I move on to something new, it's not like I abandon the thing that I just learned.
Right.
But what I like about getting to that level of something is that I haven't done the 10,000 hours of practice. I haven't done the rote stuff. I haven't done the things that those diminishing returns that get you to the top of a field, but the sort of box you in because of thinking about it a certain way for so long. Basically, what I've done is I've learned the basic principles of a thing, and then I've practiced them enough to become proficient, but not so much that I've, to use the psychological term, canalized it, right? This is the way they refer to it in psychology, is that humans have the ability, two abilities, right? They have plasticity and the ability to canalize, and they're opposites, right? Plasticity is exactly what it sounds like. We have the ability to learn new things. We have the ability to adapt to different situations. And so that's what allows us to learn new things. And so when you first approach something, you're very plastic, very impressionable, very able to learn things and grasp concepts. But the more you practice something, the more canalized you become. It's much like a stream carving a river through a landscape.
Yep.
But the downside to that is that if the rains of creativity come down, they all filter into that river and flow down that stream, right? But if you don't dig that river as deep, it provides the ability for little offshoots and little streams to form in different ways each time the rain falls. That's where I like to be at when I'm learning a new subject. I want to get to a point where not every single thing about it is impressionable, right? Because it's a bad way to be. You're very vulnerable to false information, to developing bad habits when you're first learning, all that different kind of stuff. So at the beginning, you need a very structured, regimented, practiced, well thought out, well planned way of approaching a subject. But then once you've mastered those concepts, once you can differentiate right from wrong, accurate from inaccurate, and you've practiced enough to have some second nature in how you approach it, I don't like to go beyond that. I don't like it to become an automatic thing after that, because once it's automatic, it becomes very hard to then think new and in creative ways about it.
Yeah, well, I think that the essence of what you just said is when Dennet talks about jootsing and says, and it's only a couple of pages in this book. I think we'll be talking about his book off and on a lot as we go. But that first you have to render visible that which is invisible, because when it's invisible, you're not thinking about it, and only when you think about it. I guess this is an analogy that might work, at least where we live. I have moments. So when I'm driving, there are times when you're driving that I don't notice the phone poles, the electric poles anymore. I'm seeing the vista beyond them. it's only when I slow down in my thinking or come to think about and notice them that I'm thinking how intrusive and awful and ugly and in the way of trying to do photography and everything are these sticks bent and everything. They're not trees. They're not interesting like trees, but somehow visibly they go into the background. They become almost transparent. That's what happens with concepts we've grown so used to. I think that's part of what happens with people who are so afraid of social change. Because it's got to be the way we want it to be, because it's got to be everybody's got to adhere to rules. If we don't adhere to these rules, then everything's going to fall apart. Well, first, no. Unlikely. And second, maybe some things need to fall apart that just aren't functioning very well. And we just accept them like we breathe air.
Yeah.
And I think the jootsing part comes in saying, oh, look at all those giant sticks. What can we do about this? And partly I think that's partly what led to cables being and lines being put underground. Oh, there are problems with that. So jootsing doesn't solve everything.
Right. Yeah. And we talked about Thomas Midgley being an example of that. Jootsing doesn't solve everything. And oftentimes that type of disruptive creativity is not received well by people who have identified the rules as being the overarching need of society, right? Is society shaping jootsing on the rise or decline, do you think?
Society shaping jootsing. Well, I think it's interesting because this is canted toward what one most thinks about, but I think it is very much on the rise, but in slow motion. Of the kind of on the rise that a step is taken, then those who want to just adhere to the rules that we always understood or thought we understood, or just did it because we were told to, knock it back, and then it has to rise more. So it's not I think this is important because it's not that jootsing is a smooth, nothing that Dennet says or Hofstadter that this is a smooth, simple process. And probably that's we wouldn't expect it to be. But social change is inevitable. I'm thinking about the Star Wars series Andor right now. This is totally micro, and I apologize, but in that series, there is a person who is writing a revolutionary statement about rebelling against the fascism of the empire, and makes and says, paraphrasing, that it is totally unnatural to have to constantly assert rules to control everyone, and therefore it has to be constantly energy expressed on it, and that's why it eventually will fall apart. Any fascistic attempt, sooner or later, is going to fall apart. You cannot control what everybody reads. You cannot control what people think. You cannot control how they choose or have been chosen by life to live their lives. You can squeeze, you can push, you can write legislation and rules. That's not jootsing. That's the opposite of it. That's trying to put up a barricade against a tsunami that is always going to overcome it.
Yeah, I think that that's a good point that you've expressed, and I think that it highlights that the concept of jootsing and how it's applied on a societal level is evolving. Versus you look back in the 17 or the 1800s, and you had generally like single men that were responsible for innovations, right? You had inventors. You could point to a inventor of something or to a tycoon or something like that. Not that they didn't build their empires on the backs of numerous nameless people, but
right.
you're crediting a single person with an idea. That's become much less the case. I was reading an article a while back that said, up until about 100 years ago, patents were generally filed by one person. They said now that's 99% of patents are filed by corporations, by companies. So it's an intellectual property of a conglomerate. And I think that driving from one end, right? So innovation driving from the corporate thought of many people versus the vision of one person affects jootsing in one way. And then I think there's the societal pressure. So that's the bottom up. And I think that the top down pressure, much like you said, I think that how people have always been averse to rule breaking change on a societal level. And in that way, maybe it isn't a whole lot different than in the past, right? I think that you have organizations at the top who are, some of them are looking to enforce rules and create rules they think a society can be created through rules, and other people think societies can be created through breaking rules. And I think that tension has always been there. But I think that it's sort of developed this, the question whether societal jootsing is on the rise or decline. I think it's a little bit more complicated than it at first seems, but I think that you're right. I think that, the other part of that too, right, is that, these same corporations that are filing patents, they're devoting much less money to research and development because it's not productive, right? And so without research and development, your ability to create new ideas, to joots ideas, declines. And you look at development, through really from the Industrial Revolution up through maybe the first decade of the 20th century, up until about 20 years ago, there was this rapid technological progression. And over the past 20 years, certainly there's been progression, but in the articles I read, they're always asking the question, who's going to invent the next internet? Who's going to invent the next cell phone? Who's going to invent these things? And their point is that that sort of thinking isn't taking place at universities or at businesses because they're so focused on optimizing the current technology rather than creating new technology.
I can give you an example of this. Again, nameless. When you are called into a formalized session in a conference, whether it is a superintendent's day at a school or it is a faculty day at a college, and you're put in a room, and your directive is implicitly, now think up fresh ways so we can keep doing the same thing we're doing. Think up fresh ways to maintain the status quo. But make it sound like it's not. Now, that's not the directive, of course, that is given by the well-intentioned or disingenuous person, depending on who's. But it's essentially what's being asked for. Let's be in a regimented format, which would be, let's sit at tables, and now we're going to have discussion time, and now we're going to come up with X, Y, and Z in order to accomplish what we're already accomplishing, but for it to be fresh.
Yeah.
Nah, it doesn't work.
Yeah. And this comes back to, you probably read it in the articles that we were looking at, where they were saying that, when they surveyed teachers, some huge 98% of teachers said that they wanted to encourage creativity in their students. But then the same 98% of teachers, it was shown, actually preferred less creative students when you actually started defining the parameters of what made a student creative.
What do you mean by creative?
Because creative people tend to be difficult to control, tend to be playful, tend to, again, it's just, they're all over the map, right? They don't fall into line. You can't fit them in a box. And if you're in a classroom with 20 or 30 kids, it's much easier to teach if everybody fits in their box, if everybody fits the way that they're supposed to, right? So that's a societal implication of this, right? Is how are we reinforcing, what is our message about how we want creativity to be expressed? What's our message about how we want people to philosophically approach a field? Do we just want them to practice 10,000 hours, no matter what that looks like? Do we want them to just, do we want to pay lip service to creativity, but actually just have them play by the rules? It's a very big, very important question for how we're going to not only develop individually, our individual development as human beings, but really the phylogeny of the species going forward, and that's the sort of technological progress and creative progress that we can make in solving the problems that face it,
and social progress. I'm sitting here listening to you, thinking about the people that I am fortunate to know, you among them, who are working to make sure that we don't stay on our same stodgy path for the sake of staying on our same stodgy path. My second born works in is studying dance movement therapy, which is a relatively new field. Well, not quite 100 years old yet. Therapy through the expression of body. And it's not physical therapy, it's aesthetic. And their partner, who's going to be a doctor, is in the next stages now of studying to be a doctor, but trying to apply what we know about being human with somebody else. And the dance and movement therapy is reaching out to very marginalized people and having to find out ways to reach them that a traditional institutionalized approach isn't going to necessarily enable. And so people in every field who are trying not to do the same old for the sake of it, but to figure out what are the rules that we really do need to live by in order to teach music or to have a viable plant of doing engineering work. What are the rules that are necessary, but what are the ones that can be pushed? And what are the ones we don't need anymore, because wouldn't it be wonderful if we could break this in order to get to this spot? And I think about when Dennet, when you use all the music discussion, he says, sit down at the piano and try to come up with a good new melody. You know this, how it is. And soon discover how hard that is. All the keys are available in any combination you choose, but until you find something to lean on, some style or genre or pattern to lay down and exploit a bit or allude to before you twist it, you will come up with nothing but noise. And not just any violation of the rules will do the trick.
Yeah.
And that's what you're talking about with the drummer. And what
Right. Yeah, no, and that's what my last psychology course really hit on, was this idea. They were talking about how we don't call it developmental psychology anymore. We call it developmental science, because what we discovered is that you can't study the development of a human being just by looking at the inside of a human brain. Humans interact with other people, so we need sociologists. They interact with, so you need medicine, you need sociologists, you need economists, you need philosophers, you need all of these fields, all of these people to understand how a person develops. So I think that going back to our question about is jootsing necessary to be a polymath? Well, I certainly think that some interdisciplinary knowledge is needed, because like we were talking about, if you have the system and you jump outside the system and you're in the ocean of philosophy, right? You need some other structures to draw on in order to make some changes, right?
Because nobody can swim across an entire ocean.
You can't determine if a wall is load bearing or not if you don't know what a beam is, right?
Yep.
So this was a fascinating concept. I look forward to looking at some more Dennet stuff in the future, and I'm sure that we'll be talking about jootsing in the future as well. So until next time, keep pondering.